So today in class we learned a couple different things, and one of the things we learned how to do was how to solve equations. So if you'll remember that if we have something like this, if A times B equals 0, then that means one of two things. That either means A is 0 or it means B is 0, because the only way to get 0 when you multiply is if one of them is 0. So what that works out to be like and how that helps us is that if I have something like this, it says 3x times x minus 7 equals 0, and I'm supposed to solve this, well, I know two things. I know that either 3x equals 0, because that's this part out here, or I know that x minus 7 equals 0. And I can use that to my benefit to help me work this out. So if I go to solve this, well, to get x by itself for the first one, I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and I get x equals 0. So that's one option. If x was 0, the problem would be 0. Then I have to do the same thing for the other one, x minus 7 equals 0. Well, to get x by itself here, I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and I get that x equals 7. So that's my second option. So for this problem, if x equals 0 or if x equals 7, then the whole problem is going to equal 0. So here's a similar problem. It's just a little bit set up a little bit differently, but I have two sets of parentheses, x plus 2 and 4x plus minus 12. So I've got to figure out if x plus 2 equaled 0, what would x be? And if 4x minus 12 equals 0, what would that make it? So I'm solving each piece of this. So I'm going to draw my line. To get x by itself, I'm going to minus 2 from both sides, and I end up with x equals negative 2. So that's my first answer. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. So to get x by itself, I'm going to add 12 to both sides. And I end up with 4x equals 12. And for my last step, to get x completely alone, I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And I end up with x equals 3. So either my answers are that either x equals negative 2 or x equals 3. And either one of those would be a solution to this problem. So sometimes you have to factor. So when you're factoring, remember that's when you're taking everything down into its smallest pieces. So let's start with 6. If I go to factor 6, my factors of 6 are 2 and 3. So instead of 6t squared here, I can write this as 2 times 3 and then 2t's. Minus, I'm going to do the same thing for 15. So when I go to factor 15, well, 15 is 3 and 5, so it'll be 3 times 5 times t. And I'm looking for what they have in common, what shows up in both of them. Well, there's a couple things. First of all, they both have a 3 in them. Second of all, they both have a t. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out that 3t. So I'm going to take out 3t. I'm going to mark those out, 3 and t. And they're going to go outside of my parentheses because whatever goes on the outside is what they have in common. And then left over, I have a 2t and a minus 5. So this would be my factored form. So remember, I'm looking for what they have in common. So this part here in front, this is whatever they have in common. And then what's left over, so everything else is going to go in the parentheses, so all the leftover pieces. That's everything they don't have in common. And if you notice, that's the things we didn't mark out. We didn't mark out the 2, the t, the minus sign, and the 5. And that's where the 2t minus 5 came from. So we're going to do the same thing with this one. We're going to factor, and then we're also going to be solving this problem. So in order to factor this, I'm going to start with my 12. Well, 12 is 2 times 6, and 6 is 2 times 3. So 12 is going to be 2 times 2 times 3, and then 2 x's. Minus, I can't factor 3, so I'm just going to leave it as 3x equals 0. So again, I'm looking for what they have in common. Well, they both have a 3 in them, and they both have an x in there. So I'm marking those out because that's what they had in common. So then I'm going to start off with what's left over. Well, everything that's left over, I'm going to put inside the parentheses. So inside there was 2 times 2, which is 4, and then there was an x, minus, and notice that over here we got rid of everything. So we don't just leave it blank, we put a placeholder, we're going to put a 1 there. And then that still equals 0. So now I have to use our previous knowledge about solving to finish this problem. So I'm going to take the first part, the 3x, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then the next part, the 4x minus 1, and set it equal to 0. And I've got to solve each of these. Well, the first one's pretty easy to solve. So to get x by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and I get x equals 0. So that's my first answer. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. So I need to get x by itself, which means I want x's on one side, everything else on the other. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides, and I end up with 4x equals 1. And then to get x completely by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So divide by 4, and I end up with x equals 1/4. So my two answers in this case were x equals 0 or x equals 1/4. Last question, it says the x-coordinates where the graph crosses the x-axis. So all it's looking for here is where the graph crosses the x-axis. Well, remember, my x-axis is this line right here. This is my x-axis. So I'm trying to figure out where my graph crosses that. Well, it crosses here, and it crosses here. And this value is going to be -7, and this value is going to be +1. So my answers were x equals -7 or x equals 1. And it's going to be helpful to you if you will pay attention to how this parentheses looked and this answer, and how this parentheses looked and this answer. You should notice some commonalities, and that's going to help you in the coming days.